I've caught a lot of flack on my channel for, calling sugar a drug. In fact, I didn't actually just say that sugar, exogenous sugar, is a drug in my channel, or in my videos. I also said so in my book, with much conviction, actually. Contraindicated. Again, buy that if you haven't already. Links in the description below for paperback, hardcover, and audiobook in my voice. And I wanted to actually cover this because, like everything, there's nuance here as well. And so I took a long time to really deeply think about this. I did so whenever I wrote my book, but I thought about it again. And perhaps I thought about it a little deeper. I've matured since then. However, notice how even though I've matured, much of my conclusions are still the same because, well, I made sure to be right the first time. So, anyway, we're going to be delving into that today, right now. Not only did I actually call sugar a drug in my book, but I called it an addictive drug because there is a difference. I gave a list of 6 primary reasons why that's the case. However, once again, it's quite a contentious viewpoint considering glucose is essential for proper functioning of the body, albeit with most people not knowing precisely how it's essential, but that's for another day. Now, this raises the question as to what characterizes something as a drug and an addictive drug. To begin with, there are 3 primary criteria that I believe a substance must meet in order for it to be considered a contraindicated, addictive drug. At least in my opinion. Like I said, this is all opinionated. Firstly, the exogenous administration of the substance must not be required in the concerned organism. Carbohydrates fit this criteria very clearly. Our efficiency for gluconeogenesis is very high, and therefore we do not have a requirement for exogenous glucose as human beings. We do not. Now, this criterion alone is enough to classify an external substance that has a physiological effect on the body as a drug, such as pharmaceuticals. That is true. In fact, there's even an argument to make that the definition is even less strict than that. TRT, for example, testosterone, well, that's required in the body, but the exogenous administration of it isn't required. So actually, now that I think about it, that's enough to characterize it as a drug. Now, the second characteristic of a contraindicated addictive drug is that it has the capacity to induce harm beyond a certain concentration in the body. Now, carbohydrates, of course, meet this criterion, considering diabetes exists. That being a disease characterized explicitly and exclusively as chronically elevated blood glucose and nothing else. The other carbohydrates besides glucose, such as fructose and galactose, all have the capacity for glycation as well, even if they are not directly detectable on an HbA1c test, and therefore still also fit the criterion. Now, these 2 criteria up to this point are sufficient enough, if met, to confer the title of contraindicated drug upon the substance in the context of a normally functioning organism in normal circumstances. That is the key. Drugs like anesthetics, for example, have certain indications in different settings. For example, despite the fact that they can also induce harm beyond a certain concentration and are also not required. Context matters always. The third criterion that must be met for a contraindicated addictive drug is that the substance must be dopaminergic, serotonergic, opioidergic, etc., to a degree that overrides/interferes with the rational intellect of the organism concerned. Carbohydrates absolutely meet this criterion as they are the most dopaminergic macronutrient and often cause people to consume more food than their appetite would otherwise beckon for, as well as causing most people to eat solely for the pleasure of taste, rather than any present hunger. Another subsidiary element to this third criterion is that the substance must be likely to cause a cycle of indulgence and not merely a single one. Now, this seems simple enough, but it isn't. There's actually quite a bit of nuance here to consider. So we're already touching on nuance, and now we're touching on even more nuance. Good. That's life. First of all, different substances have different degrees of dopamine, serotonin, opioid, etc. release. And this varies person to person. Also, even if this weren't the case, many people have different personality types that may or may not lead them to becoming addicted to the same substance, consumed in the same amount, and at the same frequency as other people. Other people might also say things like dietary fat is addicting because exogenous fat is not necessarily required for survival if you were to replace it with exogenous carbohydrates for energy production, and elicits dopaminergic responses as well. Some people might go even further and say, what about behaviors like sex, which are also not required for human life, for survival, at least? Let's tackle these one by one. The degree to which a substance will elicit dopaminergic, opioidergic, and serotonergic responses is a very important point to consider, as one of the defining characteristics of addiction is a self-sabotaging cycle of use, or abuse, really. I think I just realized, by the way, side note, that abuse is Ab means deviating from what's proper. Use. I think I just realized that. Abuse. That is cool. That is very cool. Therefore, we must answer two questions in order to assess whether or not the release amount of dopamine, serotonin, etc. in response to the substance is indicative of the substance being addictive. The first question is, quote, have people engaging in the consumption of the substance been, clinically, observed to engage in a self-sabotaging cycle with the substance? If the answer is yes, this is a strong indication of the substance being addictive. However, it is not entirely sufficient. The second question is, quote, is the release of this substance to the degree that we observe it being released in users and in the amount of time we see the release occur in users consistent with what the species has experienced throughout its evolutionary past, from every inference that we have, basically, to inform upon that. If the subsequent answer to this question is no, then the answer is clear. The substance is addictive. Even if you yourself do not become addicted to it, it doesn't mean the substance isn't itself addictive. The next point to address is that the affinity people have for becoming addicted to a substance does not mean that the substance isn't addictive. It still can meet criteria for being a drug according to the addiction model, that at least that I've put forth, such as not being required and causing harm beyond a certain concentration in the body. When it comes to whether or not dietary fat is addictive, first of all, it's important to note that dietary fat is actually required as opposed to dietary carbohydrates. An opponent of this position might challenge the notion that dietary carbohydrates aren't required, to which one could easily say, well, show me evidence of someone consuming 0 carbohydrates, excluding minimal extant glycogen from meat, that succumbs to ketoacidosis and or an insufficient insulin response for sufficient anabolic activity as a direct result of such behavior. Granted, lack of evidence isn't evidence of lack. That is an appeal to ignorance fallacy. But what this does mean is that this is merely speculative and not bona fide truth. However, one could go even further and say the same thing to people claiming that we require dietary fat. However, first of all, we know for a fact that the body cannot chemically create all of the fat it requires, specifically the polyunsaturated fats, believe it or not. And we also know that evolutionarily speaking, we derive the majority of our energy-creating substrate from fat and not simple carbohydrates. In fact, basically no terrestrial animal besides hummingbirds derive remotely any simple carbohydrates from their food supply, at least of any significance is what I should say, to the point where it would be considered, a significant fuel source for them. We are no different, historically, until the last 13,000 years, which does not seem to have been enough time for us to have evolved to have a diet that provides primarily carbohydrates for energy production purposes, nor the ability to proficiently withstand the glycation damage that comes along with that, unlike hummingbirds. But going back to the core argument, however, there is no observed evidence of someone consuming dietary fat in a self-sabotaging way that overrides his intellect. The only shred of evidence there is of that happening is with seed oils, fat that is not dietarily indicated to be consuming on an overwhelmingly general basis, or with butter, which is a dairy product, dairy being something that has also been consumed for a very short amount of time in the existence as a species. If there are other instances of this occurring, those instances typically are with foods that have lots of carbohydrates in them as well. And as we all should know too well, association does not equal causation. However, someone could also say this about the claim made earlier about carbohydrates fitting the criterion that involves people engaging in the use of the drug in a self-sabotaging way. Since there's no science that I am aware of that has been conducted on the addictive nature of pure sugar and pure fat, no side of this argument has any evidence to support the points, and therefore this is all speculative, to be extremely fair. However, it is in my opinion that there are multiple obvious inferences to be made that render this rebuttal quite weak, which is that many drinks that simply have a sweet taste, even without sugar in them, garner much more of an engagement than foods that have no sweetness in them at all, and simply have fat and salt in them. For example, drinks that have no fat in them are still shown to be much more favorable, especially in children, such as fruit juice. I don't think you see the same degree of addictive behavior with animal protein and animal fat as a comparison. And finally, as for the argument that things like sex should also be considered a contraindicated addictive drug by my criteria, I would also say that it absolutely can be for some people. In reality, we are not simply talking about sex, we are talking about sexual gratification, which comes in many forms. Anyone with any common sense knows that this can be addictive. It is important to note, however, that this would not be considered a substance but a behavior. Therefore, it cannot be considered a drug, but it can be considered addictive and contraindicated depending on the underlying context. Whether something is indicated or not always involves a weighing of the pros and cons to establish what the net result is, which is why anesthetics can be indicated depending on the context. but in most contexts are not. In the context of a genetically normal human, which has a normal lifestyle, carbohydrates are not indicated for human consumption. In fact, the only time they are is during a starvation situation where there is no food around except carbohydrates. There's also certain contexts, like if someone has hypoglycemia because they're diabetic, or they're not diabetic yet, but they eat lots of simple sugars and their metabolism isn't used to not consuming lots of sugar, then it would be indicated, slowly reducing the carbohydrate bolus so that it increases their efficiency for gluconeogenesis. This is why we say what we say about carbohydrates. So, is sugar a drug? Yes. Is sugar addictive? Yes. And is sugar contraindicated? In the vast majority of circumstances, yes. Our species-appropriate, species-specific diet, or the one that approximates it the most, does not include carbohydrates to any significant degree whatsoever. If you'd like to know the nuance behind the requirement for carbohydrates, because there is nuance behind every topic, refer to the link in the top right corner of the screen for information on that, because I just did a video recently about this. Yes, I still support zero carb. Don't freak out. I'm not going full Saladino. Don't freak out about that. So, with that being said, that's what I have to say about the topic. I hope that clears up the nuance, frankly, because, and the reason I say I hope is not because I'm lacking confidence. It's that there's always a possibility that I'm missing some nuance. So, I believe that's, all the nuance that really is relevant to this, making this conclusion. So, with that being said, if you enjoyed the video, leave a like, subscribe to the channel. If you're not subscribed to the channel already, what are you doing? What are you doing? In fact, hit the bell notification as well, so that you are always notified of my uploads, because why wouldn't you want to be notified of my uploads? If you have a reason for that, list it in the comment section below. See what I did there? And yeah, any thoughts that you have, by the way, leave in the comment section below. And also, the link on the bottom of the screen that just magically appeared because I'm magic. What is that link? Well, that is a link that will bring you to an amazing site with amazing products from an amazing brand known as Cerule. If you purchase product through that link, you'll get a permanent percentage discount and permanent free shipping as well when signing up for monthly deliveries. That is the caveat. And also, if you email me behind the scenes at goki@pm.me, I can tell you how to earn those products for free, because who in their right mind wouldn't want that? But of course, I would not tell you to or encourage you to buy products at all if you don't know what they are. Fortunately for you, I have a video linked in the top right corner of the screen, which is a complete video elucidation of what these products are, who should take them, why you should take them, when to take them, etc., etc. And I'd also further migrate to the description below to find a video between myself and Professor Bart K on these products in further detail, as well as the company of Cerule itself, which I think is incredibly important if you are actually considering purchasing product through the link. If you're worried about where your money's going, well, turns out we have a whole video talking about the company. So, with that being said, join me next time when we're monologuing, we're getting into the philosophy behind things, because that's important. The foundation of everything is philosophy. And talking about why you shouldn't be consuming sugar, guys, because you shouldn't be. So, till then.